Michael, drink your drink.
They said never have I ever sucked toast.
Drink your drink. Keep sucking toes.
I will smack a big bitch. What that bitch wanna do? I send you right to the Lord.
I don't give a fuck tomorrow. I might be rich as fuck tomorrow. Every day the sun will shine, but that's where we light tomorrow. What they say?
She say nothing been happening though. It's a drought.
There are moments in life when joy should be absolute. A celebration, a birthday, a simple gathering of friends around music and laughter. Those are supposed to be the evenings that live forever in photographs, in warm memories, in stories told decades later. But in Kansas City, what was meant to be a small birthday celebration for a young woman turned into one of the bloodiest nights the community had ever witnessed. A night that began with balloons, cake, and chatter would end in screams, sirens, and the devastating sound of gunfire. This is not just the story of one man pulling a trigger. It is the story of a system that saw the warning signs again and again, but did nothing to stop them. It is about a criminal record that stretched back years. A man who had been arrested multiple times with illegal firearms, and yet always found his way back to the streets. His name was Keivon Greene, and for Kansas City, he would become a symbol not just of violence, but of the failures that allowed violence to flourish. On that tragic evening, the celebration belonged to Jassity Strong, a 24-year-old woman whose birthday was supposed to mark another year of promise, laughter, and possibility. Her friends gathered, music played, drinks flowed, and for a few hours, everything felt perfect. The last thing anyone could have imagined was that before the candles on her cake were even lit, before her guests could sing "Happy Birthday," the room would turn into a battlefield. When Greene walked into the party, he carried with him not only a weapon but also a lifetime of rage, resentment, and reckless defiance of the law. What followed was not an accident. It was a rapid, deliberate eruption of violence that left 3 people dead and others critically injured. In a matter of seconds, a room filled with joy became a slaughterhouse. To understand this tragedy, we have to step back. This was not a case of an unknown stranger suddenly snapping. Keivon Greene was not a ghost in the system. He had a name. He had a file. He had a history that could be traced like breadcrumbs leading to the inevitable. Arrests, illegal firearms, violent encounters, each one should have been a stop sign, but every time, he slipped through the cracks. And every time he did, the danger to the community grew. This documentary is not only about the bloodshed that night, but also about the questions that haunt the survivors and the families of the victims. Why was he there? Why was he free? How many chances did the system have to prevent this? And what does it say about justice in America when a man like Greene can terrorize a city even after years of warnings? As the night unfolded, Kansas City would be shaken to its core. Witnesses would watch their friends fall in pools of blood. Parents would receive phone calls that no parent should ever hear. And a city that had already known violence would be forced to ask itself whether it had grown numb to tragedy or whether this was finally the moment that would break through the silence. But the story does not end with the gunfire. In fact, that is only the beginning. The manhunt that followed would grip the community in fear. The trial that came later would shine a brutal light on the justice system's blind spots. And through it all, the voices of the victims' families would demand to be heard, refusing to let their loved ones become just another set of names on a growing list of statistics. This is the story of Keivon Greene. This is the story of Jassity Strong. This is the story of how a single night of violence revealed everything broken about the world meant to protect us. And now, we begin at the very start, before the bullets, before the chaos, before Kansas City was left to pick up the pieces of a shattered birthday. Kansas City has always been a city of contradictions. On one hand, it is a place of jazz and barbecue, of working-class pride and Midwestern warmth. On the other, it has been plagued for decades by cycles of crime, poverty, and a justice system stretched too thin to handle the weight pressing against it. For people who grew up there, the sound of sirens at night was as common as the song of cicadas in the summer. Violence was not always shocking, it was expected. But even in a city accustomed to heartbreak, the name Keivon Greene would soon strike a deeper chord of fear and anger. Keivon Greene's story did not begin on the night of the massacre. It began years earlier, written in a trail of police reports and mugshots. Born and raised in Missouri, Greene grew up surrounded by the kind of instability that often leaves scars. But while many people in similar circumstances find ways to survive, to break free, Greene seemed to lean into the chaos. He became familiar with the revolving door of the local justice system before he was even out of his teenage years. By his early 20s, Greene had already racked up charges for possession of illegal firearms. Time after time, officers confiscated weapons he had no legal right to own. Time after time, the courts let him slip back into the world he had already proven he could not handle responsibly. Prosecutors warned that he was dangerous, that he showed no sign of reform, but the system seemed incapable or unwilling to hold him accountable for long. What made him especially dangerous was not just his access to guns, but his attitude toward them. Friends and acquaintances would later describe him as reckless, quick to anger, and unafraid to show off his weapons as if they were trophies. He carried himself like a man untouchable, convinced that rules applied to everyone but him. And in many ways, he was right. Despite multiple arrests, despite repeated encounters with law enforcement, he was always free again within weeks or months. The community around him began to notice. Neighbors whispered about the young man who always seemed to find trouble but never seemed to pay for it. Some feared him, others dismissed him as just another product of a broken system. But absolutely no one imagined just how far he would go. The red flags were there. Every arrest was a flare in the dark sky, a warning shot of what could come if someone did not intervene. But warnings are only useful if someone acts on them, and in Keivon Greene's case, no one did. By the summer of 2024, Greene was 28 years old. Old enough to know better, young enough to still believe in his own invincibility. He carried with him a reputation for volatility, a man who could not be trusted to keep his temper in check. But life has a way of blending menace into the background, until it becomes just another part of the scenery. People knew Greene was dangerous, but they had no idea just how dangerous. On the 25th of August, a warm Saturday evening, a group of friends gathered to celebrate the birthday of Jassity Strong. The 4-year-old was known for her laughter, her energy, her ability to light up a room. She had her flaws, as everyone does, but to the people who loved her, she was magnetic. That night was supposed to be hers. Her friends decorated the space with balloons and streamers, the kind of cheap party supplies that carry more joy than their price suggests. Music pulsed through the walls, the bass thumping like a heartbeat, while guests arrived carrying drinks, hugs, and stories. It was a scene as ordinary as it was beautiful. Ordinary in the sense that birthdays happen every day. Beautiful in the way that youth and friendship can make the simplest gatherings feel monumental. For the people in that room, the night was about nothing more than celebration. No one had reason to believe that death would be joining the party. But then, Keivon Greene appeared. His arrival was not planned. He was not a close friend of the birthday girl, not part of the inner circle who had been invited to share cake and memories. But in communities where everyone seems to know everyone, it was not unusual for an extra guest to show up. At first, no one questioned it. A new face at a party was just that until it wasn't. Witnesses would later say that when Greene entered the room, the atmosphere shifted. Some described it as a sudden heaviness, a tension that didn't quite make sense. Others said they felt nothing at all until it was too late. Greene himself carried an energy that was unpredictable, sometimes charming, sometimes cold, always impossible to read. That night, he was quiet, almost too quiet, as if something was brewing just beneath the surface. And then, without warning, the silence exploded. Greene pulled out a gun. In a matter of seconds, what had been a room full of laughter turned into chaos. Guests screamed. Some froze in shock. Others dove for cover. The popping sound of bullets tore through the air, sharp and merciless. People dropped to the floor, blood spilling across the decorations meant for celebration. Balloons burst under the weight of stray gunfire. Their cheerful pops twisted into echoes of horror. 3 people would not make it out alive. Others lay bleeding, their lives hanging in the balance as chaos consumed the room. Amid the screams, amid the desperate scramble for safety, one truth became clear. The warnings about Keivon Greene had come to fruition. The system's failure to stop him had arrived at its inevitable, bloody conclusion. By the time the police were called, it was already too late. The party was destroyed, lives were ended, futures were stolen, and Greene, calm, composed, almost detached, fled into the night, leaving behind nothing but devastation. For Kansas City, this was more than just another shooting. It was a turning point. A moment when the community could no longer ignore the question that had haunted it for years. How many chances should one man get before the system decides enough is enough? The answer had come too late for Jassity Strong and the others who died that night. But for the survivors, for the families, and for a city already scarred by violence, the search for answers was just beginning. In the aftermath of the shooting, Kansas City woke to yet another headline about violence. But this time, the details were too brutal to ignore. 3 people were dead. Several more were wounded. A birthday celebration had become a bloodbath. And the name at the center of it all, Keivon Greene, was already familiar to law enforcement. The early morning hours were filled with chaos. Patrol cars sealed off the block where the party had taken place. Yellow police tape stretched across the front yard, flapping against the humid summer air. Officers moved in and out of the house, their radios crackling with updates. Inside, the scene was nothing short of carnage. Overturned furniture, shattered glass, blood pooling where balloons and confetti should have been. For investigators, the brutality was overwhelming. But for the families, it was worse. Mothers and fathers arrived at the scene only to be held back by officers, their cries of disbelief echoing through the neighborhood. "That's my baby in there," one woman screamed as she collapsed against the barricade. The sound carried down the street, a raw reminder that behind every statistic was a name, a face, a story now ended. The victims were soon identified. Among the dead was Jassity Strong, just 24 years old, whose birthday had been the reason for the gathering. Her friends would later say that she had been dancing only moments before the gunfire erupted, her laughter swallowed mid-breath by the sound of bullets. Alongside her, 2 others lost their lives. One, a childhood friend who had come to celebrate. Another, an acquaintance caught in the wrong place at the worst possible time. Their names would soon circulate in the news, each headline stretching the wound wider for the families left behind. The injured were rushed to nearby hospitals, emergency rooms filled with frantic loved ones waiting for news, clinging to scraps of hope as doctors worked through the night. Some would survive, scarred both physically and emotionally. Others would never fully recover from what they had seen. The image of a friend's last breath. The sound of screams turning into silence. Meanwhile, the man responsible was gone. Witnesses said Greene fled almost immediately after the shooting, vanishing into the darkness outside. By the time police arrived, he was nowhere to be found. What he left behind was not just destruction, but a trail of questions. Why had he opened fire? Was there an argument? Was it premeditated? Or was it simply a moment of rage? Detectives pieced together fragments from survivors. Some said Greene had been quiet all night, barely interacting, his presence more shadow than substance. Others recalled a tension building between him and another guest, though no one could pinpoint exactly what had sparked it. What everyone agreed on was this: the shooting had been sudden, merciless, and deliberate. As the investigation unfolded, Greene's past came into sharper focus. His record was not just long, it was alarming. Multiple arrests for firearm possession, repeated charges that went nowhere, a pattern of violence that seemed to grow bolder with each passing year. Time and again, he had been given another chance. Time and again, he had squandered it. To the families of the victims, this was the deepest wound of all. It wasn't just that their loved ones had been taken, it was that the tragedy had been preventable. He should have never been on the streets, one grieving father told reporters, his voice trembling with rage. If the system had done its job, my daughter would still be alive. The anger wasn't just directed at Greene. It turned toward the justice system itself, a machine so clogged and inconsistent that dangerous men slipped through its cracks every day. Community leaders began to ask the same question that echoed through living rooms and church halls across the city. How had this been allowed to happen? Prosecutors who had once handled Greene's cases admitted off the record that they had seen this coming. They knew he was reckless, knew he posed a threat, but proving intent in court, securing lengthy sentences for gun possession, those battles were harder than they seemed. Without strong witnesses, without airtight cases, the charges often collapsed, and so Greene walked free. Again and again, the consequences of that failure were now laid bare in blood. Meanwhile, the manhunt for Greene intensified. Detectives canvassed neighborhoods, following up on tips from anyone who might have known where he went. His face appeared across television screens and social media feeds, a mugshot paired with the warning, "Armed and dangerous." Residents were urged to stay cautious. For many, the fear was palpable. If Greene could kill 3 people at a party without hesitation, what was to stop him from killing again? But Greene was slippery. He had survived in the shadows before, and he knew how to move without drawing attention. Days passed without an arrest. Each one felt like an insult to the grieving families. Each sunrise a reminder that justice was still out of reach. Funerals were planned in the meantime. Black clothing filled pews as pastors spoke of lives cut short, of promises never fulfilled. Friends delivered eulogies through sobs, their voices cracking under the weight of loss. At Jassity Strong's service, a cousin read aloud a poem she had written for her. Your birthday candles were lit, but the light was stolen too soon. The room wept as one. Reporters covering the funerals described them as both heartbreaking and enraging. It wasn't just grief, it was fury. A community already stretched thin by years of violence now found itself boiling over. Calls for reform grew louder, with residents demanding that leaders stop treating shootings as statistics and start treating them as warnings. Behind the scenes, detectives worked around the clock. They retraced Greene's steps, interviewed his acquaintances, tracked his phone records. Slowly, a picture emerged of a man spiraling further into desperation. Greene was not hiding out of fear. He was hiding out of calculation, waiting for the storm to pass. But storms like this don't pass. They only gather force. For Kansas City, this wasn't just a story about one man and one night. It was about a city forced to confront the cracks in its own foundation. How many more Keivon Greenes were out there, slipping past the system's defenses, waiting for their chance to unleash chaos? The question lingered in every corner of the city as the hunt continued. And with every passing hour, one thing became painfully clear. Until Greene was found, no one felt safe. The search for Keivon Greene stretched on, and with every day that passed, the city's frustration deepened. He had vanished into the shadows, but the consequences of his actions were everywhere, on the front pages of newspapers, in the tear-stained faces of grieving families, and in the restless whispers of a community that wondered how long justice could hide. Detectives working the case felt the weight of the city on their shoulders. Every morning began with the same ritual. Stacks of reports, tip lines overflowing with calls, witnesses to re-interview. Some leads were promising sightings of Greene in neighborhoods he once frequented, rumors that he was staying with friends or distant relatives. But each lead seemed to dissolve when chased down. Greene was always one step ahead, as though he had rehearsed this vanishing act for years. What investigators couldn't ignore was his history. They pored over his record like archaeologists digging through ruins, uncovering layer after layer of violence and missed opportunities for intervention. Greene had been arrested multiple times for illegal firearm possession, yet had walked free almost every time. Court documents showed a troubling pattern. Charges dismissed, witnesses recanting, plea deals struck. Each time he slipped through the cracks, his confidence grew, and each time, the danger he posed to others multiplied. Former prosecutors spoke candidly to reporters. "We knew he was a ticking time bomb," one admitted, "but the system isn't designed to deal with men like him until it's too late." Those words haunted the families who buried their loved ones. Too late. Always too late. In the weeks after the shooting, the community tried to stitch itself back together, but the wound was too deep. Vigils sprang up on street corners, candles flickering beneath photographs of the victims. People gathered, prayed, and demanded action. At one vigil, a pastor raised his voice over the crowd. "We cannot let this city grow numb to bloodshed. These are not numbers, they are our children." The crowd responded with a chorus of amens, but the grief in their eyes betrayed how powerless they felt. Local media kept the pressure alive. Every evening news broadcast reminded viewers that Greene was still at large. His mugshot, stone-faced, eyes cold, flashed across the screen with the words, "Wanted for murder." The coverage was relentless, but so was the silence from the manhunt. Detectives were frustrated. They had chased fugitives before, but something about Greene's ability to evade capture gnawed at them. He wasn't a mastermind, but he was resourceful. He knew the streets, and he knew how to disappear. Meanwhile, the families waited for answers that never came. For them, the absence of justice was almost as cruel as the loss itself. Every knock on the door made them wonder if this was it, if the police had finally found him. Every day without news felt like betrayal. He's out there living his life, one grieving mother told a reporter, while my daughter is in the ground. Inside the police department, the tension was just as heavy. Officers felt the community's anger like a constant drumbeat. Some began questioning whether they had the resources or manpower to bring Greene in quickly. Others wondered if he had fled the state altogether. But the detectives leading the case refused to give in to despair. They doubled down, focusing on his habits, his weaknesses, his old patterns of behavior. It was then that a clearer picture began to emerge. Greene wasn't just hiding, he was unraveling. Informants whispered that he had grown paranoid, constantly moving from place to place, unable to trust even those closest to him. His world was shrinking, but he clung to the illusion of control. He thinks he's smarter than everyone else, one tipster told detectives. But he's scared. I can see it in his eyes. Fear, after all, is the one enemy no fugitive can outrun. The city's patience was wearing thin. Protests erupted outside the courthouse, not just for Greene's capture but for systemic change. Signs read, "No more excuses," and "Justice for Jassity." The chants echoed off the stone walls, a demand that leaders could no longer ignore. Politicians gave speeches promising reform, tougher gun laws, and better enforcement. But for the families in mourning, words felt empty. They wanted results, not rhetoric. The turning point came when detectives began examining not just where Greene might be, but who might still be protecting him. They revisited old associates, friends, cousins, girlfriends, anyone who might give him shelter. Many claimed ignorance. Some genuinely seemed terrified of him, but buried within the network of half-truths and evasions, investigators found cracks, and through those cracks, light began to shine. They learned Greene had been sighted near an abandoned house on the east side of the city. The tip seemed flimsy at first, one of many rumors that had already wasted precious hours. But this one felt different. The caller had details only someone close to Greene could know. The clothes he wore, the car he was riding in, the fact that he never stayed in one place for more than 2 nights. Detectives leaned in. This was no random tip. This was real. Surveillance was set up. Officers moved quietly, blending into the neighborhood, waiting for any sign of their target. Hours turned into days. Nothing. The frustration mounted again, but just when it seemed the trail had gone cold, a figure emerged from the shadows late one night, slipping through the broken door of the house. Tall, lean, moving with the cautious gait of someone who knew he was being hunted. The silhouette matched the man in the mugshot. It was Keivon Greene. The sighting reignited the chase, and the city braced itself for what would come next. For law enforcement, the question was no longer if they would catch him but when, and for the families of the dead, that moment couldn't come soon enough. Because justice delayed, they knew all too well, was justice denied. The hunt for Keivon Greene had reached a fever pitch. For weeks, the streets buzzed with rumors of sightings, sometimes credible, often wild fabrications born from fear and speculation. He was seen in a corner store, someone claimed. Another insisted he had been spotted boarding a bus out of town. But the reality was more unnerving. Greene was still in Detroit, hiding in plain sight. Detectives, exhausted but relentless, began to weave together a tighter net. They knew fugitives like Greene couldn't stay hidden forever. A man on the run grows desperate. He makes mistakes. He leaves crumbs. And slowly, the investigators began to collect them. One of the most important breaks came from Greene's own carelessness. Surveillance footage from a gas station captured a figure resembling him late at night. Hoodie pulled tight over his head. He didn't look like a killer, confident in his freedom. He looked jittery, checking over his shoulder every few seconds. His body language screamed paranoia. The detectives paused the tape, leaning in. They knew it was him. The neighborhood where Greene had been hiding was one of decay and survival. Abandoned houses dotted the streets, like broken teeth. Places where fugitives often found refuge, but even here, his presence was noticed. Residents whispered about a stranger slipping in and out of a boarded-up home. Children too frightened to play outside pointed to the house with wide eyes. The fear he carried with him infected the entire block. Inside the police department, tension built like a drumbeat. Every day without an arrest meant more pressure from the public, more questions from the media. Was Greene smarter than the detectives chasing him, or simply luckier? Had he received help from people too afraid or too loyal to turn him in? But the manhunt was about to change. Through phone records and quiet surveillance, investigators traced Greene's movements to a small network of friends who were still willing to risk everything for him. Some provided food. Others lent him a car. In the shadows of desperation, loyalty sometimes runs deep. But detectives knew that loyalty could be cracked. And so, one by one, they began knocking on doors. What they found was telling. Many of Greene's associates were exhausted, drained by the constant fear that harboring him would end with them in prison. Some admitted they hadn't seen him in days. Others confessed they were tired of the calls at midnight, the frantic demands for money or shelter. "He's using us," one finally admitted. That confession was enough to shift the momentum. The noose was tightening. Meanwhile, the families of the victims lived in a cruel limbo. Every news update pulled at their emotions. When the television anchors spoke of progress, hope flickered in their hearts. When nights ended with silence, despair settled in again. "We can't rest until he's caught," one mother said during a candlelight vigil. Her voice trembled, but her resolve was unshakable. "My baby's gone, and I won't let the man who did this walk free." In the broader city, frustration boiled over. Community activists organized rallies, demanding accountability not just from the police but from the system that had allowed Greene to roam free despite his violent history. The name Keivon Greene became a symbol of failure, a reminder that the city's most vulnerable often paid the price for institutional cracks. And then, a lead broke everything open. Detectives received word that Greene had been spotted once more near the same abandoned house. This time, they didn't hesitate. A team was assembled quietly, strategically. They studied the layout of the block, the entry points, the risks. The operation had to be precise. Any mistake could allow him to slip away again, or worse, endanger innocent lives. The night of the raid was tense. Officers moved in silence, their boots crunching softly against broken glass and gravel. The house loomed in the dark, its windows shattered, its door hanging crookedly on rusted hinges. Inside, shadows shifted. For a moment, the silence felt unbearable. Then came movement, heavy footsteps, the scrape of a chair. They had him cornered. "Police, come out with your hands up." The command rang through the night, sharp and unyielding. From inside, silence. Then, the sound of frantic scuffling. Greene was there, and he knew it was over. What followed was chaos compressed into seconds. Officers breached the doorway, flashlights slicing through the darkness. Greene, wild-eyed and desperate, lunged toward the back of the house. For a heartbeat, it seemed he might slip through yet again. But this time, the law was faster. Within moments, he was tackled to the ground, his arms wrenched behind his back, steel handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists. The fugitive who had haunted Detroit for weeks was finally captured. The weight of the city seemed to exhale. News of the arrest spread quickly, phones buzzed, reporters rushed to the scene, neighbors gathered in clusters on their porches, whispering prayers of relief. Justice, long delayed, had finally taken its first step. For the families, the news was bittersweet. Tears flowed as they embraced, both from relief and from the reminder that no arrest could bring back the lives stolen. But knowing that Greene was behind bars offered something they had been denied for too long: a measure of peace. In the interrogation room, Greene sat defiant, his face a mask of cold detachment. He answered few questions, often smirking as though the gravity of his crimes hadn't sunk in. But beneath the bravado, investigators saw what they had expected all along: fear. The days of running were over. Detroit, however, was left with deeper questions. Why had a man with such a violent history been allowed to slip through the cracks so many times before tragedy struck? How many warnings had been ignored? And how many lives might have been spared if the system had acted sooner? As Greene was led away in chains, the city watched, weary but resolute. Justice was finally moving forward, but the scars of his crimes would remain long after the headlines faded. For Detroit, this wasn't just the end of a manhunt, it was a reckoning. The courtroom was heavy with silence on the morning of Keivon Greene's arraignment. The man who had once taunted his victims on Facebook Live, who had slipped through the cracks of a system meant to contain him, now sat shackled in front of a judge. The chain around his waist rattled softly every time he shifted in his chair. But otherwise, he seemed almost detached, his expression unreadable, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the walls of the courtroom. For the families of his victims, that day marked the beginning of a new kind of battle. No longer a hunt on the streets of Detroit, but a fight for justice inside the walls of the legal system. They filed into the benches of the courtroom, clutching framed photographs of their loved ones, holding each other's hands for strength. Their eyes never left him. The charges read aloud painted a chilling portrait. Multiple counts of first-degree murder, assault with intent to kill, unlawful imprisonment, and a string of firearm violations. Each word was a reminder of the horror he had unleashed. Each charge echoed with the weight of lives destroyed. The prosecutor, a seasoned attorney known for her relentless pursuit of violent offenders, stepped forward. Her voice was steady, but her tone carried an edge sharpened by righteous anger. She told the court that this was not a crime of passion, nor a moment of madness. This was deliberate, cold, calculated. Greene had chosen to humiliate, torture, and kill, streaming his violence for the world to see. The defense, in stark contrast, tried to chip away at that narrative. They painted Greene as a product of his environment, a man raised amid poverty, violence, and neglect. They argued that his actions were the consequence of trauma, that the system had failed him long before he failed anyone else. It was an argument the jury would eventually have to weigh. Was Keivon Greene a monster? By nature? Or by nurture? But for the families, those arguments rang hollow. Nothing could excuse what he had done. No childhood pain could justify the brutality of the killings. They sat through every hearing, every motion, every delay, their grief carved deeper with each passing day. The trial itself became a spectacle. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps, cameras flashing, microphones extended to capture every comment, every reaction. Detroit was riveted, torn between horror at the details and fascination with the man at the center of it all. True crime shows speculated about his motives. Podcasts dissected his life, and nightly news broadcasts replayed the haunting footage from that fateful Facebook live stream. Inside the courtroom, the testimony was grueling. Friends of the victims took the stand, their voices breaking as they described the men they had lost. Their humor, their kindness, their unfulfilled dreams. Investigators detailed the painstaking manhunt, the evidence collected, the mistakes that allowed him to evade capture for so long. And then came the experts, explaining the psychology of control and humiliation that had driven Greene to broadcast his violence to the world. At times, Greene smirked. Other times, he stared blankly at the floor, unmoved by the words that cut so deeply into the people sitting just feet away. But whether he showed emotion or not, the mountain of evidence was undeniable. The jury heard it all. The chilling audio, the frantic 911 calls, the grainy surveillance footage, and finally, the testimony of those who had barely escaped his wrath. The atmosphere was suffocating. Every day in court felt like reopening a wound. And yet, the families endured. They owed it to their loved ones to see it through. As the trial moved into its final stages, the prosecutor delivered her closing argument with the kind of quiet fury that silenced the room. She reminded the jury of the victims not as names on a legal document, but as sons, fathers, brothers. She spoke of the fear they felt in their final moments, the cruelty inflicted upon them, and the audacity of a man who broadcast their deaths for entertainment. Justice, she said firmly, is the only answer left to give. The defense pleaded for mercy. They argued that Greene's life, though marred by violence, was still a life, that a sentence of life imprisonment would be enough. But their words felt hollow compared to the brutality etched into the evidence. When the jury finally retired to deliberate, the families waited in unbearable silence. Hours stretched like days. Every footstep in the hallway made hearts race. And then, at last, the announcement. The jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled once more, tension thick as smoke. The foreperson rose, a sheet of paper trembling slightly in their hands. One by one, the charges were read, each verdict punctuated by the same word, guilty. The families wept. Some clutched each other tightly, others bowed their heads in prayer. For them, the verdict was not victory, it was closure, a small measure of justice in the shadow of unbearable loss. Keivon Greene stood silent as the weight of the jury's decision settled over him. For the first time, the smirk was gone. His face was pale, his eyes dull. Perhaps he finally realized the finality of his fate. The judge, stern and deliberate, pronounced the sentence, life in prison, without the possibility of parole. The words hung heavy in the air, a judgment as permanent as the grief carried by the victims' families. Greene was led away in chains, disappearing into the machinery of the prison system he would never escape. For Detroit, The trial's conclusion marked the end of a chapter, but not the end of the story. The scars would linger. The questions would remain. How had a man like Keivon Greene slipped through so many cracks? How could the system be rebuilt to ensure no other families suffered in the same way? In the weeks that followed, community leaders used the trial as a rallying cry. Calls for reform grew louder: better mental health resources, stronger intervention programs, swifter responses to early signs of violence. The case became more than a tragedy. It became a lesson carved into the history of the city. For the families, though, the lesson was personal. They would carry it in the empty chairs at dinner tables, in the birthdays uncelebrated, in the laughter that would never again fill their homes. Yet they also carried something else. The knowledge that they had stood together, demanded justice, and seen it delivered. In the end, the trial of Keivon Greene was more than the prosecution of a killer. It was a reckoning with violence, with community, with resilience. And though the wounds would never fully heal, the verdict offered something Detroit desperately needed: a glimmer of hope. The courthouse had fallen silent in the days after the verdict, but for the families of the victims, the silence was deceptive. It wasn't peace, it was absence. The long months of hearings, the endless news coverage, the constant hum of cameras and reporters, all of it faded the moment Keivon Greene was sentenced to life in prison without parole. For some, that silence felt like relief. For others, it was the beginning of a new, more painful chapter. Life after justice. Detroit, too, began to move on. The headlines that once screamed of a killer who broadcast his crimes online were replaced with new stories, new tragedies. But in the neighborhoods where the victims had lived, nothing would ever be the same. Murals went up on brick walls, memorial candles flickered on street corners, and vigils were held where friends and family shared memories, trying to keep alive the essence of those they had lost. The story of Keivon Greene became a cautionary tale spoken in whispers in classrooms, in sermons at churches, in late-night conversations among parents worried about their children. It wasn't just the horror of the murders themselves. It was the chilling reality that such brutality had been streamed for strangers to watch, liked, shared, commented on. The violence had not existed in isolation. It had lived online, multiplied through clicks and views. That fact alone left the city uneasy. What had it meant that people had tuned in to watch? That no one had intervened quickly enough to stop it? Was the audience complicit, even if they hadn't realized it at the time? These questions didn't fade with the verdict. They lingered, haunting the city as much as the crimes themselves. For the families, healing was slow and uneven. Some turned their grief into activism, speaking at schools and community centers, warning others about the dangers of unchecked violence and untreated trauma. They spoke about their loved ones not as victims, but as full, vibrant people whose lives had been cut short. Others withdrew from the spotlight, preferring to mourn privately, away from the relentless scrutiny of the public eye. But all of them carried scars that would never fully close. Birthdays came and went. Empty chairs sat at holiday tables, and memories became both comfort and torment. Justice, as the prosecutor had promised, had been served. Yet justice could not bring back a son, a brother, a friend. For Detroit law enforcement, the case became a rallying point for reform. Officers were retrained on how to respond to online threats. Partnerships were forged with tech companies to identify and report violent live streams before they spiraled out of control. The case of Keivon Greene became a blueprint, an example of how the digital age had changed the very nature of crime. And yet, the system remained imperfect. For every new safeguard, there were loopholes. For every new policy, there were questions about enforcement. The shadow of Greene's crimes hung over these efforts, a constant reminder of what had been lost. In the wider world, the case became a topic for criminologists, sociologists, and psychologists. Documentaries dissected Greene's life, asking whether his path to violence had been inevitable. True crime podcasts revisited the case, their narrators' voices hushed with the gravity of the story. Some called him a monster, others a symptom of larger societal failures, but all agreed on one thing: his crimes had left a permanent scar on the city and on the families he had shattered. As the years passed, the details blurred in the public memory, but not for those who had lived it. For them, time did not erase the moment they learned their loved ones were gone. It did not soften the echo of that Facebook live stream. The world might have moved on, but they could not. One mother, speaking at a community event years later, summed it up with heartbreaking simplicity. People talk about closure, but there is no closure. There is only survival. Every day, we survive without him. Her words captured the truth at the heart of the story. Justice had been delivered, yes, but closure, the neat, cinematic ending people yearn for, did not exist. What remained was endurance, strength, the quiet resilience of people who had been broken, but refused to stay broken. Keivon Greene now sits behind concrete walls and steel bars, his days blending into one another in the monotony of prison life. He is a man who once commanded the world's attention, now reduced to a number in the system. Some say that is fitting, that obscurity is its own form of punishment. Others argue that it is not enough, that his very existence is an insult to the memories of the men he killed. But whether one sees his life sentence as justice or as leniency, one fact is certain: he will never walk free again. And perhaps that is the only victory left to hold on to. Detroit has seen its share of violence, of loss, of grief, but it has also seen resilience. The city that buried sons, brothers, and friends also stood together to demand justice and to rebuild in the aftermath. The legacy of the case is not just one of tragedy, but of survival. As the credits roll on this story, it is important to remember the lives at the center of it. They were more than victims in a headline, more than faces in a live stream. They were people full of dreams, laughter, love, people whose lives mattered. And in the end, that is the heart of every true crime story. Not the killer, not the violence, not even the trial, but the people whose absence leaves a hole in the world that can never be filled. So tonight, as we close this chapter, let us not remember Keivon Greene as the man who streamed his crimes. Let us remember the lives stolen, the families forever changed, and the community that chose to rise in the face of darkness. Because true crime is not just about death, it is about what survives after.